I'm the President of the Military History Society of New South Wales. It's wonderful to see everyone here. Welcome to our members and our non-members. Again, it's a pleasure for you to be here today. Just before we start, just a few housekeeping. If you could please check that your mobiles are either off or on silent, that would be greatly appreciated. In an event of emergency, we will follow the instructions of the memorial staff. Just a little bit of an announcement in regards to one of our friends in the military history circle, Beyond the Battlefield. If you haven't picked up a brochure, there are some brochures available on the desk. John Hall, who's John Hall, who facilitates those lectures. You can also ask any questions. There's a number of speakers that will be part of this year, so please take one on the way out. And if you haven't bought a ticket, you can do so now very quickly, and there'll be a raffle later on in the morning session. We welcome some new members: Ralph Clark, Wayne Hoffman, Michael Kelly, and Wayne Clark. Welcome to the Society. And just another announcement is that we as a society have changed our email account. Now, some members here may be asking why they do not have those current email push-outs. So if you don't, can we ask you to check your junk mail or your spam mail? Because you might find that they're going there and you'll need to redirect those emails to your inbox. Can we just get a show of hands, any members who are not getting regular emails from the Society? Show of hands, any members? Okay, good, you've done the right thing, well done. You get a point, no you don't. But congratulations, thank you so much. Well, we do know that there is an issue. We've got a better email account. It's a lot easier, and in the sense from our point of view, the administration part. But if you know anyone who might be struggling with connecting, just let them, I'll ask them to check their junk or their spam, because it's probably going straight there until they redirect it. All right, so I'm going to hand over to Warren, who's part of our committee, to introduce our speaker this morning.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the President, Council and the members of the Military History Society of New South Wales, I would like to introduce Dr David Chessum as our presenter for this month's lecture titled The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. I see there's obviously some naval interest in this gathering today, and the numbers are quite healthy. So David, you've heard a bit of a draw card. I would also like to add a special mention that David's contribution today started at our inaugural Military History Society the New South Wales Conference, New South Wales at War, almost 2 years ago on the 7th of October 2023. It is great to see you here, David. We finally got you. It's great. So David served for 23 years as a weapons engineering officer in the Royal New Zealand Navy, including 2 tours of duty as the head of department in Leander-class frigates. And he also attended our Australian Command and Staff College in Canberra, as I did probably a few years before you, David. Since leaving the RNZN, David has been employed as a chartered professional engineer in both consulting and government roles, and has compiled a comprehensive academic record, and you can see that in the flyer that went out. It also includes a lot of information and research about his lecture today, which was on the subject of his research of his PhD thesis. Hopefully will be a book coming out soon, Dave, on the interwar period naval arms control, which was at the University of New South Wales. David remains active in naval historical circles and volunteers as both the Australian National Maritime and the Nepean Naval Museums as a volunteer. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr David Chessum.
Okay, good morning. Right, I'll see if we can do this one.
Just the arrow.
I've got it upside down.
Upside down. He's an engineer. I'll just press it.
Doesn't surprise me.
It's all good.
Right. Okay. Right, off to a good start. Okay, well, thank you all for coming along this morning. Although my research topic covers the entire interwar naval arms control period, what I'm going to be talking about today is the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which really kicked off that process. I'm going to be primarily talking about the way that the treaty managed, the impact of the treaty on capital ships, why the parties entered into that treaty and what the impact of the treaty was, and also what the impacts were on other classes of ships. So I think that was all in the flyer, so we'll get into it. To fit the Washington Naval Conference into its historical context, it was the first of a series of naval arms control conferences that were held between World Wars I and World War II. So look at the diagram, you can see with the bookends of the two world wars, we had this series of conferences starting with Washington, going through Rome, Geneva, and the two London conferences. In parallel with that, the League of Nations were also running broader disarmament conferences with a much larger group of people. And as you would expect, trying to hold a conference that dealt with everything with up to 60 parties, the League of Nations conferences went nowhere. And then towards the end of the period, they moved away from the formal naval conferences, and Britain entered into a series of bilateral agreements, primarily with the two agreements with Germany, one with the Russians, and some lesser agreements with Poland and the Scandinavian countries. So what was the background of the conference? The chart there shows the balance of naval power at the end of World War I, in terms of the numbers of dreadnoughts. And with the scuttling of the German fleet at Scapa Flow, Britain had achieved almost an all-power standard. Her navy was effectively as strong as all the other navies in the world combined. She was in an unassailable position, and it was a situation which was highly satisfactory to the British Empire. But then there were three things happened. During the First World War, the United States had passed the 1916 Naval Program, which was a very large authorization. It covered more than 200 ships. It included 10 battleships and 6 battle cruisers, with the intention of making the United States Navy second to none. After the United States entered into the war, the program was put on hold so that the United States could focus on building destroyers to assist with the anti-submarine war that was being fought in the Atlantic. But after the war, the pressure to develop the US Navy, in particular their objections to the way that Britain had interfered with American trade when they were still neutral in World War I, saw the 1916 program restarted, and all 16 of those capital ships were then laid down. As a response to the American program, the Japanese developed what was known as the 888 program, under which they were going to build 8 battleships and 8 battle cruisers, none of which would be more than 8 years old, so it would be an ongoing program. And while this was happening in the Pacific navies, the European navies were busy cancelling the ships that they had started building during the war. So Britain cancelled 3 of the 4 Hood class, and the French and the Italians effectively cancelled or stopped working on all of the capital ships they had under construction. So the effect of that, if you look down, within 2 years, the situation had changed dramatically. Not only was with the disposal of older ships, Britain was getting to a point where the United States was approaching parity in numbers, but in fact the American ships were newer and larger than the British ships, and Britain was heading towards becoming the second naval power in the world. So given that Britain's empire relied upon supremacy at sea, this was a dire threat to Britain. And so there was a strong desire within Britain to come to an accommodation with America. For the basic reason is that America was now the most powerful economy in the world, and Britain knew that she couldn't win an uncontrolled naval race with the United States. So what were the triggers for the conference? The conference originated in the United States, and one of the key triggers was that although they had started the 1916 program, the ships had all been laid down, the way that the Americans funded capital ships is they were funded on a year-by-year basis, and having started the largest peacetime shipbuilding program in history, they lost the political support, and the President and his advisors came to the conclusion that they were not going to be able to get funding from Congress to complete the program. So this huge shipbuilding program they had was in trouble. The other issue the United States had was the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which had been successively renewed, which the Americans saw as a threat, and that they felt if they ever got into trouble with Japan, that they would have British opposition as well. And I'll talk more about the Anglo-Japanese alliance later on. For Britain, the trigger to attend the conference was that they were projecting the loss of their maritime supremacy, and although they did reluctantly lay down order the class of 4 capital ships, although it's not really clear whether there was ever any intention of actually building them. It was believed that Lloyd George saw them as a negotiating tactic. But they had a very strong desire to avoid a naval competition which they did not believe they could win. In Japan, there was a gradual realisation that the economic boom that they had come out of World War I when they were able to sell everything they wanted to the Allies, by 1920 the economic boom was over, and they had come to the conclusion that their 888 program was unaffordable, and they had to find a way out of it. So the big 3 powers all had a desire, all felt they were trapped in a situation which didn't look good for them, and they wanted to find a way out of it. The other 2 powers that attended were France and Italy. For France, it was never about naval disarmament. Their focus was on continental security and a desire to resurrect the Anglo-US security guarantee which had been made at Paris in 1919 but had subsequently been withdrawn. And the Italians really didn't have a strategy. They were just extra attendees. Okay, so the key issue that had to be resolved with the conference was the issue of relative strength. In order to have an arms reduction agreement, people had to agree what their relative strength would be, and there were 4 different ratios that needed to come to agreement with. The first one and the most contentious one was the relative strength between the United States and Japan. The issue here is that both powers had done the maths and they both came up with the same answer. In order for America to be able to prevail in the Western Pacific, they needed to have a 3 to 2 superiority, which is a ratio of 66.6%. So both navies had independently come to that same conclusion. Therefore, the Americans went in wanting to reduce Japan to a 60% ratio. The Japanese went in demanding a 70% ratio. And both parties believed that the ratio that they were asking for would give them what they needed. They then buttressed their arguments with very detailed statistics which in their opinion justified the ratio they were asking for. And it was a very heated debate, but it was effectively resolved because the Americans had cracked the Japanese codes, and they were aware that the Japanese government had given instructions to the delegation that ultimately they had to accept the 60% ratio. So the Americans held firm, and ultimately the Japanese accepted the 60% ratio on the basis of other compromises later. The second ratio, which was fundamental, was between the United States and the British Empire. And this was resolved relatively amicably. The Americans proposed parity, Britain accepted it. It would have been interesting if Britain had said, well, the mathematical formula that you use to justify your 60% ratio with Japan would have justified us having 120% superiority over you. But as far as Britain, they considered it to be a practical solution to the problem, and it was settled without argument. The third ratio, which almost wrecked the conference, was the ratio to be allocated to France and Italy. France, although they had no intention of building capital ships, they went into the treaty saying, we've got 10 capital ships, we want to be able to replace them, and they demanded a allocation of 350,000 tonnes to build 10 35,000 tonne capital ships, which would have given them a navy bigger than Japan's. America was quite happy with that, but Britain wasn't. Britain, they were accepted the one power standard vis-a-vis the United States, but they required a two power standard between the next two major powers. So if Japan had a 60% ratio of Britain, they required France to have a ratio of less than 40%. The French refused to accept that, and the conference came very close to foundering on that. Ultimately, it was resolved by the United States Secretary of State communicating directly to the President of France over the head of his delegation with a blunt statement that if you don't accept this, the conference will fail. And the French President overruled his delegation and accepted the reduced ratio for France. And the final ratio was between France and Italy. Italy went there asking for 90% and expecting to get 8%. The original American proposals offered them parity, and they described themselves as a gift from the gods. They didn't even have to argue it. For some reason, French didn't object to it then, although that subsequently poisoned the subsequent naval conferences. That France never accepted the concept of parity with Italy, and they never accepted any quantitative limitation after the Washington conference because on the basis of that issue. So, having settled the issue of ratios, the big question is how they were going to get there. And the US had basically three proposals. The first was stop now. All capital ships under construction were to be cancelled and disposed of. This was one that America appeared to be making the largest sacrifice. They had the most ships under construction. The other powers did not know about their budgetary difficulties, and it seemed to be an extremely magnanimous offer. The second concept was scrap down, which, having stopped new construction and having established the relative size of the Navy, would be to scrap the older ships to bring the Navy down to the size needed to meet the ratios. And the third proposal was a building holiday under which no capital ships would be built for 10 years. And it was believed that these three actions would stabilise the capital ship competition. And those proposals were accepted by the parties in principle, subject to reservations. Key reservations were France, while they ultimately did accept that for capital ships, they refused to allow the ratios or any other constraints to be extended to other classes of ships. And the other exception was to the building holiday is that France and Italy successfully argued that they had abandoned their capital ship programs during the war. All of their ships were considerably older than the American, British and Japanese ships, and therefore they obtained the right to start building 2 new capital ships after a period of 5 years. They didn't have to wait the full 10 years for the holiday. So, as a consequence of the acceptance of these proposals, there was a number of consequences. Firstly, by stopping the construction of ships that are currently under construction, the powers had modern ships with modern protection systems that were available for weapons trials. And both the United States and Japan used these partly constructed ships to develop their weapons. So the picture you can see there is of the Japanese battleship Tosa, which was taken out and used as a trial for various weapons, which were quite significant in the lessons that were later implemented in the Yamato class battleships. Second consequence was industrial atrophy, and this is something that really concerned Britain. If they were going to stop building capital ships for 10 years, building capital ships required specialist resources, equipment, tooling and labour. If you don't build them, that capacity will atrophy, which means at the end of the 10-year period, when you have to replace your entire battle fleet because they're all 15 to 20 years old, you will not have the capacity to build the ships. Britain tried very hard to replace the building holiday with a graduated program of replacement, and the American naval delegation was relatively open to that, but used that negotiation was happening, got back to London, and the British government under Lloyd George overruled them and said, no, we're accepting the building holiday primarily for budgetary reasons. The Lloyd George government wanted to increase spending on welfare and social programs, and they couldn't afford to do that and build battleships at the same time. Another impact of having a prolonged building holiday, noting that the 10-year holiday was then subsequently extended for another 6 years by the First London Naval Treaty, is that it effectively opened the door to new entrants, because when the building holiday finally came to an end, the major battle fleets were all 15 plus years old, which means a new country could come in and start building effectively on equal terms. And that's what happened. At the outbreak of World War II, the two countries with the most capital ships, or most tonnage of capital ships under construction in the world, were Russia and Germany. Had the war not broken out when it did, they would have effectively leapfrogged into a position of parity with the other navies, simply because Britain and America did not have the ships that would otherwise have been built during the interval period. And one of the final impacts was that without building any new ships, there was extensive reconstructions undertaken on existing ships. And that was something that was new. Generally, ships were built, they'd get obsolete, you'd refit them and maintain them, but you didn't do major reconstructions because it was more cost effective to replace them. Because they couldn't build replacements, the three major navies in particular did very extensive reconstructions of the capital ships under production. And the degree of modification can be shown by that. If you look at the battlecruiser Renown that was rebuilt before World War II, the cost of her reconstruction was approximately half the cost of a brand new capital ship. And for that, they got a ship that was only expected to last another 6 or 7 more years, which was nowhere near as capable as a new ship. So they weren't cost effective, but because of the building holiday, they had no option but to reconstruct the older ships. So there were two compromises which were used to induce the Japanese to accept the 60% ratio. The first was the non-fortification zone, so which is not very clear, but it's the only one I can find. The area that's shaded was an area where it was agreed that there would be no new or enhanced fortifications in the Pacific Islands. And this had two major impacts. It meant that America could not fortify their bases in the Philippines to create a fortified base from which to attack Japan. And it meant that Japan could not fortify the mandates that they'd taken over from Germany after World War I to create a barrier to the Americans resupplying the Philippines during the war. So this was seen as primarily benefiting Japan because it would give them security in their home waters. Importantly, the fortified zone included Hong Kong, so that Britain could not enhance the fortifications of Hong Kong, but it specifically excluded both Singapore and Hawaii. And the second compromise was the termination of the Anglo-Japanese alliance. Now this had been a very contentious issue in the British Empire. The treaty had come up for renewal in 1921. Australia and New Zealand wanted to keep the alliance. They saw it as being the only way effectively of achieving security against Japan. Canada was adamant that it needed to be removed simply because of American opposition. The American opposition was absolute on the grounds that their belief was as long as the alliance was in place, they needed to be able to have the strength of both Britain and Japan combined. It was also irrational. The alliance had been amended in 1913 so that it didn't apply against any country with which Britain had a treaty of arbitration with. And Britain had what they told everyone was effectively a treaty of arbitration with America. So Britain had made very clear to both Japan and America that the treaty would not act in the event of a war between America and Japan. And even in American internal strategy documents, they were quite clear. If there was a war between Britain and Japan, they did not expect between America and Japan, they did not expect Britain to intervene, treaty or no treaty. If there was a war between America and Britain, they expected Japan to join it, treaty or no treaty, to take opportunity. So the treaty itself had no impact. But what the treaty did do was it created an association between Britain and Japan, which was acting as a restraining influence on Japanese policy. And there are a large number of experts at the time and since who believe that if the treaty had remained in place, it may well have moderated Japanese behaviour and may well have made the World War II in the Pacific less likely. So, although America thought that one of their greatest achievements at Washington was removing the Anglo-Japanese alliance, in reality it was an own goal, and they would have been better leaving in place. To mollify the Japanese, it was effectively replaced with a quadruple agreement between Britain, Japan, America and France, which was a toothless agreement where they would agree to consult each other if their security was threatened. And so, yeah, that was the sacrifice that was made at Washington in order to get America to sign the agreement. Now, the Stop Now proposal that America had proposed involved stopping the construction of all ships under construction. And they had produced lists of those ships and how to implement the agreement. The issue was that the Japanese claimed that the battleship Mutsu was complete. Now, they had rushed it to completion prior to the treaty. It had started at sea trials, although there were still some weapons and equipment that weren't fitted. But it had been to sea, and the Japanese were insistent that they be allowed to keep it. And they buttressed their argument that some of the funding for the Mutsu was apparently raised by Japanese schoolchildren. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that was the argument they used. So what they said, well, we want to keep Mutsu's complete, we want to keep Mutsu, and we'll get rid of Setsumaki, it was an older ship. And then we saw, and we were all even. The problem was that the way the original draft treaty was balanced was that each of the three big navies had one post-Jutland ship. The Japanese would have the Mutsu, the Americans would have the Maryland, and the British would have the Hood. If Japan kept the Mutsu, that would give them two post-Jutland ships, which would unbalance the treaty. So the compromise that was reached was that, as an exception to the Stop Now proposal, America could go ahead and complete two of their ships that were under construction. So they completed the Colorado and the West Virginia. Britain didn't have any ships under construction, so that was agreed that they could build two new ships from scratch, which turned out to be the Nelson and the Rodney. And so when the Americans completed their two ships, they would have to scrap two of their older ships. When the British completed their two ships, they would have to scrap four of their older ships. So that would mean that in post-Jutland ships, there would be a balance of 3-3-2 between the three big navies, which would maintain the ratios that were desired. So that was the one major exception to the Stop Now proposal that was agreed. So this diagram here shows where we ended up to after the treaty. So you can see at the top, this is the number of capital ships to be retained. Now, you can see the British were actually initially allowed to keep 4 more battleships in America. That was because the British capital ships at that stage were older and smaller than the American ships because they had largely stopped building ships during World War I. The advantage would come down to 2 when the Nelson and Rodney were completed and 4 of the older ships were scrapped. And while it appears that Japan, France and Italy had the same number of capital ships, the difference was that the French and Italian ships were their biggest ships were smaller than the smallest Japanese ships. Furthermore, 3 of the French ships and 4 of the Italian ships were old pre-dreadnoughts of very limited value, and one of the Italian ships was actually sunk at the time. Leonardo da Vinci had blown up in World War I and capsized. They raised it and they were planning to repair it, so they included it in the treaty, although in fact it was never repaired and ultimately was scrapped. So in the second graphic, you can see the green is the tonnage that was allowed to be completed, allowed to be retained, and then the purple was the tonnage that they would have once all the existing ships were replaced. So the treaty included replacement schedules which said which ships could be scrapped when and what ships could be built to replace them. And so that while initially Britain would have a tonnage advantage, ultimately their tonnage would be equal. And the final purple lines show the final ratios, which was 5, 3, 1.67. In terms of the number of ships to be scrapped, you can see here the Americans scrapped the largest number of ships, although the majority of their ships were incomplete ships, but some of them were quite well advanced. And of these ships to be scrapped, one of the British Empire one was in fact the Australia. So Australia attended the Washington Conference as a member of the British Empire delegation. They weren't actually invited, they just, the Dominions turned up. So while they signed as individual nations, the treaty quotas were allocated to the empire as a whole, and it was up to the empire to allocate those quotas within the dominions as they saw fit. So, having dealt with the existing ships, they then talked about the replacement ships, and so they set quantitative limits for the new ships that would be built to replace the existing ships after the building holiday was over. So the limits that were agreed were 35,000 tonnes and 16-inch guns. These limits weren't retrospective, so they didn't apply to existing ships, although there was only one ship that significantly exceeded those limits, which was the Hood. So they were allowed to keep the Hood even though it was over 40,000 tonnes. But any new ships would have to meet these limits. The other thing they had to define was a standard displacement. Prior to the Washington Conference, the various navies used different ways of measuring the displacement of ships. They used legend displacement, normal displacement, trial displacement, full load. They also used different tonnes. There's the metric tonne and the imperial tonne. And so when you see tables of data of ships in the World War I period, the numbers are simply not comparable. So they came up with a definition of a standard displacement. And this is it here. It's a completely artificial number because it says as ships completed, ready for sea, but with no fuel on board, which of course is not a state it will ever actually be in at sea. And that was negotiated on the basis that the British Empire claimed their ships required to have worldwide, ability to deploy worldwide, and therefore they needed to carry more fuel, and it would be disadvantageous to them if the additional fuel limited the other capabilities they can build into the ships. There are a number of problems with this. First of all, it's actually quite difficult to predict the displacement of a ship you're building. In a time before computers and spreadsheets, when you actually designed a ship, calculating the displacement of the ship was actually a challenging task. If you'd already built a similar ship and you're just modifying it, then you could do your deltas. But if you're designing it from scratch, it was a challenge. And for example, the first Japanese ship they built under this regime, which was the cruiser Yubari, they underestimated its displacement by more than 20%. And then the first British battleships that were built, which are these two here, the Nelson and the Rodney, they were designed to be 35,000 tonnes. They came in 1,500 tonnes underweight. That wasn't because the British built them smaller than they were allowed to, it was an estimation error. That makes enforcement and compliance difficult because if it's really hard to predict how much a ship will displace when you're designing it, if the ship comes out overweight, have you cheated or was it just bad luck? So in fact, when the British did dock an Italian cruiser after it had an accident off Gibraltar, they calculated the ship was over 10% over the limit. But they were cautious about accusing the Italians of cheating because that simply could just be bad calculations. Some of the other issues came out of the circumvention is once you've created a limit on the size of the ship, there was a natural tendency for people to try and cram as much onto the ship within that limit as they could. So measures for circumvention included the idea of fitting forward but not with. These days we do it because we can't afford the gear. Back then they were doing it because if you fitted it forward but not with the equipment, in wartime you could fit the gear on, you'd get a bigger ship and more powerful ship. So for example, the Japanese with their cruisers, they were designed to have tubes in their torpedo protection system, metal air-filled tubes which would absorb the impact. they built them without those tubes with the idea that they would put them in wartime. The French used coal for protection. This coal is actually quite an effective way of protecting against splinters. And in coal-fired ships, the coal bunkers were part of the protective system. In their interwar cruisers, they no longer had coal-fired boilers, but they were putting coal on the ships and saying, well, it's fuel, so it's not covered in the standard displacement, and it was a way of getting something for nothing. And the other trick was ammunition allowances. They'd build the ships with magazines that might take 120 rounds a gun, but they say, we're only putting 80 rounds in there, so we're only going to count 80 rounds towards the standard displacement, even though there was every intention of actually filling the magazines when they went to war. And I found that one quite interesting because it's a very clear breach of the word of the treaty, and yet 4 of the 5 powers independently decided to do that without ever discussing it with each other. They all came up with the same checking mechanism. So the other one thing they dealt with was reconstruction of capital ships. The Americans inadvertently let it slip during the negotiations. They planned to rebuild the existing ships to keep the industrial plant going. So it was decided there had to be some limit on what could be done. So they came up with a very long-winded clause, which basically said, well, yes, you can reconstruct them within limits. You can't add more than 3,000 tonnes. You can't increase the belt armour. You can't increase the main armament, effectively increase the main armament. Which seems to all make sense, but there was one particularly controversial issue when it came down to the elevation of the main armament guns. The Americans, when they went into the treaty, their ships had less elevation than their main armament guns, which meant that they would be heavily outranged by the Royal Navy. And they had calculated in the event of a battle between the American and British fleets, they would be heavily defeated because the British could engage them at a much longer range. So they wanted to increase the elevation of their guns, and they believed that under this clause, there was nothing in there to prevent them from doing it, because they weren't changing the calibre, number, or general type of mounting of the main armament, they were just increasing the elevation. Britain opposed this on the basis that they were increasing the elevation of guns was a reconstruction, and it wasn't being done for the purpose of providing means of defence against air or submarine attack. So that was debate, and initially, although Congress had funded the modifications, America refrained from increasing the elevation of the guns in the first battleships that were reconstructed after the treaty. Subsequently, it became apparent that Japanese were increasing the elevation of their guns. At the London Naval Treaty, there was an exchange of notes between Britain and America where they agreed that it was no longer a breach, or it was never a breach of the agreement. And most of the American ships had their elevation increased for World War II. But a small number of older American ships and many of the British ships had not had that modification. And that resulted, for example, in a battle with the Italian Navy where one of the Royal Navy battleships was unable to engage because the Italian ships were outside the range of the limited elevation guns. So I've talked about capital ships. Aircraft carriers were a bit different because they were new. So there were very few of them in existence, and so it wasn't a matter of disarmament, it was about putting a cap on how far they would be developed. So they came up with a quantum limit, so 27,000 tonnes, and they limited the guns to 8 inches. It may seem odd to limit the guns on an aircraft carrier, but at the time there was a lot of concern that people couldn't build battleships, they would build so-called aircraft carriers and put battleship-sized guns on them. So they were limited to 10 guns of 8-inch calibre. And then they set qualitative limits, the numbers are up there for each of the 5 navies, for what tonnage of aircraft carriers they were allowed to build. There was a loophole that vessels that were under 10,000 tonnes were not limited, so you could build as many aircraft carriers under 10,000 tonnes as you wanted. And the Japanese actually exploited it. They did build one that was allegedly just over 7,000 tonnes. But that loophole was then closed at the London Naval Conference in 1930, so the small aircraft carriers would count. Now, one of the things the Americans wanted to do was they they wanted to take advantage. They had these large ships already under construction, and they wanted to convert 2 of them into aircraft carriers. So the Lexington class battle cruisers, the hulls had largely been built, and they wanted to take advantage of that for economy. And the problem was that these were going to be 40,000 plus battle cruisers. You couldn't convert them into a 27,000 ton aircraft carrier. The hulls were simply too big. And so there was a clause built into the treaty that although the standard was 27,000 tons, each of the powers could build 2 ships up to 33,000 tons, and for that purpose they could convert 2 ships which would otherwise be scrapped or disposed of in accordance with the treaty. And so the Americans used that clause to convert the Lexington and Saratoga from battle cruisers into aircraft carriers. The Japanese were going to convert the battle cruisers Amagi and Akagi into aircraft carriers. Amagi was wrecked in the Tokyo earthquake, so she was replaced by Kaga as a replacement. Now the problem was that although the Americans had agreed to 33,000 tons, they couldn't actually get these ships down to 33,000 tons. They then leaned back onto the reconstruction clause, which I've reproduced here. And they said, well, because they're existing ships, we can use a 3,000 ton reconstruction clause. Now, there was a lot of contention about this, and it was all within the United States. Nobody else objected to this, but within the US there were a lot of arguments as to whether or not it was actually legitimate to use that. And at one stage, several years after the conversions had commenced, the Secretary of Defence directed that the ships were to be modified and reduced in tonnage to 33,000 tonnes because what they were doing was not compliant with the treaty. That was a fairly radical thing. To get it down to 33,000 tonnes, they were going to remove half the propulsion machinery, which would significantly reduce the speed of the carriers and significantly reduce their utility. And eventually, the US Navy officers prevailed on the Secretary of Navy, and he rescinded his order, and they were completed about 2,500 tonnes over the limit. Now, you can argue whether that was whether they complied with the treaty with that tonnage. I'm not convinced they were. They convinced themselves they were, but they never declared that tonnage to the other treaty powers. They always declared them their 33,000 tonnes plus we've used some of that allowance. Now, this had an effect when it came to their compliance with the overall quota. This graph shows you the 6 aircraft carriers that the Americans constructed under the Washington Naval Treaty. There was one before that, the Langley, but however, because she was in existence at the time of the treaty, she was considered to be experimental, so they were allowed to dispose of her. So you can see the second from the right column where it goes down the cumulative tonnage based on the declared tonnage of 33,000 tonnes. So that when they laid down the WASP in 1936, they exactly used their 135,000 tonnes of their quota. But if you use the actual tonnage, which they were required to actually use, they were actually 5,000 tonnes over the limit, and so therefore, regardless of whether they were actually entitled to use that reconstruction allowance for the Lexington and Saratoga, they were clearly in breach of the treaty when they laid down the WASP. But they weren't alone in terms of compliance. This is the Japanese agreement. The Japanese had a much simpler strategy. They simply under-reported the tonnage of all the ships. So you can see there the five aircraft carriers the Japanese built. Now the Akagi and Akaga were converted from ships the same size as the Lexington and Saratoga. They were huge. There is no practical way you could have got those down to 26,900 tonnes. And the reason they wanted them below 27,000 tonnes, because there was another clause in the treaty, once they went over 27,000 tonnes, they were only allowed 6 8-inch guns, and they wanted to put 10 8-inch guns on them. So they pretended they were under 26,000. But by systematically under-reporting the displacement, the Japanese actually secured effectively under 20,000 tonnes, which is a whole aircraft carrier, over and above the submarines. Although they don't appear very significant in the treaty, there was a lot of discussion about them. The original American proposal was that they would simply be limited in pro rata with the battleships, and they would just be another category of warship. Britain went into the treaty as she had gone into the Paris Peace Conference, strongly advocated for the abolition of the submarine. The submarine menace had scared Britain during World War I. It was the one thing that could have cost them the war, and they wanted to negotiate them out of existence. France was absolutely opposed to both the American proposal and the British proposal. France saw the submarine as being the weapon for the weaker power and as an equalising force, and they insisted on a very large quota of submarines. In fact, the quota was so large that the Americans wouldn't agree to incorporate that into a ratio system, because a fair quota was this big, because when they added the American and British ratios on top of it, the quotas would be huge, meaningless, and would never be fulfilled. And so there was effectively no limitation on the number of submarines that could be built. The only limitation, which is academic really, is that they were covered by the same 10,000 tonne 8-inch ratio as other auxiliary warships, but no submarines would only be given that anyway. So cruisers, again, the American original proposal was to limit these in pro rata with the capital ships. Now Britain did have a problem with that, because Britain had the Empire sea lanes to protect, and she said, well, we need the same number of cruisers with our fleet as the Americans, we need additional cruisers to protect our sea lanes around the world. That argument never carried weight with the Americans, but their escape clause was when the French refused to limit submarines. They said, well, if submarines are unlimited, we need to have an unlimited number of anti-submarine vessels to protect against them, therefore we won't accept limitation on auxiliary warships. Now someone could have pointed out you don't use 10,000 tonne cruisers to hunt submarines. No one did point it out, and the cruisers went on unlimited, apart from the qualitative limit of 10,000 tonne and 8-inch guns. And those limits were built because it was bigger than anything anyone was building at that time, so it was a safe limit. What it did was that automatically became a target, and everyone wanted to build the maximum cruisers. So whereas no one had wanted to build cruisers that big before the treaty, everyone was trying to squeeze 8 guns into 8-inch guns with 10,000 tonnes. And they all struggled to do that because it was very hard to build a balanced 8-inch gun cruiser. That one there is in fact HMAS Australia, which was one of the early ships built to these limits. So, now going on to the question of why did the various powers sign up to the agreement. This was the first very really successful multilateral arms control agreement in history, where people who are so-called allies got together and mutually agreed to reduce them. And the answer is there was something in it for everybody. For the Americans, they got recognition of parity with the Royal Navy on the cheap. Now, they didn't have to fight for it, they didn't have to spend a fortune, they got it handed them. They solved the problem that they had this large construction program they didn't have the money to complete. They successfully contained the Japanese fleet at 60%, which is a ratio that they believed would prevent the Japanese from threatening them. They got rid of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, and they prevented the Japanese from fortifying the mandates. Now, yes, it prevented them from fortifying Guam and the Philippines, but as the American delegate said, they had no hope of getting money to build those fortifications anyway. So they traded fortifications they were never going to build for fortifications that the Japanese almost certainly would have built. For Britain, appeasement is a word that has a very bad context these days because of the Austrian chat. But this was a case where Britain successfully appeased America. America didn't need to have a navy second to none, they didn't even need parity, but they wanted it, and by Britain giving them the recognition that they were entitled to it, it took the heat out of the American drive for a navy second to none. And the Americans never actually built up to their treaty limits because they didn't actually need to in the interwar period. Britain retained the freedom to build all the cruisers they wanted to build, thank you France. They managed to lock down the two-power standard with Japan and France, or at least they could deploy a fleet superior to Japan and still keep a fleet at home that would be as big as a European power. And while other navies were arguing to finish ships that were already under construction, Britain got the opportunity to build 2 brand new ships incorporating all the lessons of World War I. And so, and they got the Nelson and Rodney, which in my opinion were by far the most powerful battleships of the entire interwar period. For Japan, they also managed to negotiate their way out of a building program that they couldn't afford. They despite their disillusionment with the 60% ratio, they did achieve relative security in their home waters. Without a secure base, America couldn't successfully attack Japan with their peacetime forces, and no treaty would limit the amount the Americans could build in wartime anyway. And the treaty actually resulted in the best American-Japanese relations that had existed for a very long time. The relations were very warm, and that showed after the Tokyo earthquake, where there was a lot of assistance from America. It didn't last. America introduced anti-immigration policies, and things turned bad after that. But however, at the time, it did significantly improve relations between the two powers. For France, France was very unhappy with the treaty, to the extent that the government fell when it came up for ratification. The French Parliament did not like the treaty. However, in reality, they only sacrificed the right to build vessels they had no intention of building in any case. And they retained the relevance of their obsolete battle fleet. Had the Americans, the British and the Japanese gone ahead and built these 40,000-ton ships they were planning to build, or they were already building, the old French battleships would have become irrelevant. But because that major powers kept older fleets, the French ships were relevant, and one of their objectives was to maintain a balanced fleet, where in the event of an Anglo-US war, the French Navy would be big enough to tip the balance one way or the other. They were banking on continued Anglo-American hostility. When that didn't happen, that strategy fell flat. But their fleet did remain relevant in any case. Italy was fairly similar. They got parity with France without even asking for it. They maintained the relevance of the obsolete battle fleet. But importantly, the treaty substantially changed the balance of forces between Italy and Britain. Prior to the Washington Naval Conference, the Italian fleet had no hope of having any influence over British policy. It was simply too small. The Washington Naval Treaty changed the ratio to the degree that by the early 1940s, Italy was able to seriously contest the Mediterranean because the British fleet had been reduced in size to the extent that they could no longer overwhelm them. So in terms of assessment of the treaty, in the immediate aftermath, it was an interesting split. The political leaders all thought they'd done a great job. They all went home and said, this treaty is great. It's given us exactly what we wanted. We've got security, we've got economy. Interestingly, the naval leaders of all countries were universally condemning. They all saw, they saw the glass half empty. They all saw what they were sacrificing without necessarily seeing that other people were sacrificing the same thing. The other is that a lot of the naval leaders, particularly in America and Japan, did not appear to be aware how vulnerable their funding lines were. The American Navy in particular thought that all those ships were going to be built when their political leaders had absolutely no intention of completing them. France, I mentioned before, the opposition was vitriolic and the French government fell, but they still ratified the treaty. After World War II, there was a significant reassessment. The context of that is we had all these negotiations for disarmament, and we still ended up with a war. Therefore, those treaties failed. They didn't achieve what they wanted to do, and it was a bad strategy. And Churchill made the comment as we didn't build ships we could have built, but we let everyone else to build whatever they wanted. It was it's what you would expect. They've all lost millions of people, and they were looking for a scapegoat, and the treaties got blamed. Then during the Cold War, and we started again to negotiations with the Russians. And again, there was a split in assessments. The people who wanted to do deals with the Russians wrote theses and articles talking about how good the treaties were and how they could have worked if we'd only done them properly, and we've got to try that again. The people who didn't want to do deals with the Russians would write articles and theses about what a disaster it was, and it didn't work, and it caused World War II. And that's still the case. Even today, historiography is split. And it's split because people are trying to look for lessons that support their current agenda. So what are the lessons for the future? So these are the 3 lessons I picked out. First is compliance. Everyone knows the totalitarian powers cheat on the treaties and everyone beats them up for it. No, but everybody cheated on the treaties. The British, the French, the Americans, we all cheated. The lesson for that is that when people you give people a choice between their national security and compliance with the treaty, they will choose their national security every time. The totalitarian powers didn't cheat because they were bad, they cheated because it's a human thing to do, and you should anticipate that in the future, which is why we need much stronger verification mechanisms. The second issue was the role of national pride and face culture. There were a number of times during interwar negotiations where powers were presented with something which was in their interest to sign, but they would not sign it because they felt it was belittling to them or it affected their national pride. Now, the Japanese and the French were the most poignant for this, but it wasn't just them. The Americans at one stage, there was an agreement, there was going to be an agreement in the early 1930s on submarines between France and Italy. The Americans said, we think it's a great idea, we simply can't sign it because we can't accept an agreement that allows the French to build more submarines than we need. And so, if you can't rely on rational logic as to whether what a country will do. If a country has a strong face culture, they may well take actions which are inimical to their long-term future. And the final one is circumvention, which is possibly just a repetition of compliance. Once you start limiting something, it's like whack-a-mole. You limit capital ships, people start spending money on cruises. You limit cruises, they start spending money on something else. Whatever you limit, if people have a desire to spend, they will find something to spend in the unlimited categories. And that's it. I'm happy to take any questions.
Can I just ask, because we are limited in the use of this space, can I just ask if you ask a question, it has to be a question. So try to not make it a time when you get on a soapbox and you want to hear your opinion. I'm sure it's very important, but we are looking for questions. Okay? A bit louder.
Why don't we include Germany in the make-up of their own relations?
Okay, so
the outcome of Bismarck.
Okay, so Germany had been limited by the Treaty of Versailles, which preceded Washington. So at that stage, she was already limited to 6 capital ships of 10,000 tons. So the Washington Treaty was only between the victorious powers, so they were all allies. There was a desire later on to bring Germany into the Second London Naval Conference. It didn't happen because the French wouldn't agree to anything that compromised the Versailles Agreement. And so ultimately the British entered into bilateral agreements with Germany. So the first Anglo-German naval agreement effectively imposed the Washington Treaty limits on Germany. But Germany wasn't part of the Washington Treaty system.
Why did Britain not ask for or get offered the opportunity to build 2B aircraft carriers from her scrap battle cruisers and battleships, the way the Japanese and the Americans did? Why didn't she insist on it?
She was. All the powers, the clause I put up, all the powers were entitled to build 33,000 ton ones. Britain did convert the Courageous and Glorious, the 2 large light cruisers. Technically, they didn't fall under that clause because they were less than 27,000 tons, and Britain wasn't actually required to scrap those 2 ships. But Britain could have built from scratch 2 33,000 ton carriers, but they would have taken up 66,000 tons of the quota. And Britain wanted to build 5 carriers, and that means keeping them small.
Do you argue because you came away from the first Washington Treaty happy were the Italians? Everyone else had the sacrifice of Italy went in with no expectations and got more than what they wanted.
Well, I think all the politicians went away happy. They all thought they had solved their problems. But the Italians did very well out of it. They had never planned to ask for 100%. They got given it to them on a platter.
After the lessons of Jutland, well, the battle cruiser was shown to be an inferior animal. Why did nations still insist on keeping battle cruisers?
Well, that was their choice. Britain could have got rid of all their battle cruisers and kept older battleships. Battle cruisers were still seen as having a value as a fast wing of the battle fleet. And in fact, the battle cruisers they kept were more useful during World War II than the old battleships. Simply because of their speed, they could keep up with the carriers. Renown was still a front-line unit in 1945 when all the R-class were tied up. But Britain could have got rid of them and kept older battleships had they wanted to.
Britain, it appears from what you've said that Britain failed to see the strategic significance of submarines. Obviously it wanted to stop the threat, but it had no plans of its own to build a submarine force.
Well, Britain had the largest submarine fleet in the world, I think. It may have been, I'm not sure, relative to America. Britain had a very large submarine fleet, and they were very active in submarine building. But they were happy to sacrifice that if it meant that everyone else got rid of their submarines. And it was interesting that strategy changed because of the Anglo-German naval agreement. They limited, in 1935, they limited the German Navy to 35% of their fleet in each category, except for submarines, where Germany actually had the right to build up to parity, which was a fairly odd choice. But Britain believed that ASDA had the submarine mastered, and they underestimated the resurgence. But Britain did see the value in submarines. They just saw the value. They saw the threat greater than the value.
Paul Simon. Did the Washington Naval Treaty restrict the ability of the Dominions to form their own navies in the interwar period? Indeed, how did Australia, the only substantive Dominion Navy, react to this arbitrary discussion halfway around the world?
Okay, so Australia attended, all the self-governing dominions attended the conference in their own right. They hadn't been invited. America only invited Britain. Britain brought their dominions with them. So they had a common delegation. It didn't affect the right of the navies to form the dominions to form their own navies, but their navies did have to fit within the overall British quota. So that meant that if Australia had wanted to keep the battlecruiser Australia, Britain would have had to have disposed of another ship. And in the London Naval Treaty, where the same thing happened, all the Australian and the New Zealand cruisers came out of the British quota, so that so Britain's quota was reduced, but that was an internal thing within the empire. There was debate about this before the 1935 London Naval Conference. Ireland and South Africa wanted to go their own way. They didn't want to be part of an overall quota, even though they had no intention of building any warships. But that was all about them asserting their independence. Australia wanted to stay in the quota. It was felt that by staying in the quota, it allowed free interchange between the navies, and it meant that Australia could transfer second-hand ships to Britain and receive second-hand ships from Britain, which they did. Whereas, had they not been in the same quota, we could not have taken over Sydney, for example, because the treaty prevented you from transferring second-hand ships to another navy in a way that they could become a vessel of war in that navy. So the Dominions were in it because they wanted to be in it. Australia particularly was insistent on attending their conference. If Australia wanted to keep Australia, they could have just said, we weren't invited, we're not coming. They would have authority to vote on us. They said it, they signed it, and the Australian Parliament ratified it.
Last question.
What was happening with the Russian Navy at last time?
Okay, the Russian Navy was in a state of disarray at this stage, and the Soviet government wasn't really recognised by anybody at that stage, so they weren't invited. The next conference, the 1924 Rome conference, the Russians were invited, and they were very problematic. They insisted on the right to build replacements for all their ships of the same tonnage they currently had, which would have given them a navy significantly bigger than Japan's. And they also had a whole lot of political concessions. They wanted to close various straits around the world. So the Russians did attend that. They attended the League of Nations Disarmament Conference, where they were similarly disruptive. They did eventually get brought into the system in 1937 under the Anglo-Russian Naval Agreement, which mirrored the 1937 Anglo-German Naval Agreement, under which Russia did accept the same qualitative limits as the 1936 London Naval Treaty. But they had a carve-out that the ships they were building for the Pacific wouldn't be limited because the Japanese weren't limited, and they basically ignored it anyway because their battleships were substantially more than 35,000 tonnes.
Well, can we just put our hands together and thank you?